To understand the sheer magnitude of the terror that ruled the North Atlantic during the early years of the Second World War, one must first understand the mathematics of failure. For the first 3 years of the conflict, the confrontation between a British destroyer and a German U-boat was defined by a clumsy, deafening dance that overwhelmingly favored the submarine. The ocean is a vast, three-dimensional hiding place, and the primary weapon used by the Royal Navy, the depth charge, was a blunt instrument born of the First World War. It was a 300-pound drum of explosives rolled off the stern of a ship, relying on a hydrostatic fuse to detonate at a preset depth. The tactical flaw in this method was absolute and terrifyingly simple: to drop the charge. The destroyer had to pass directly over the submarine. However, the ship's eyes, the ASDIC echolocation system known to the Americans as Sonar, looked forward and downward at an angle. As the ship rushed in for the kill, the sonar beam would inevitably pass over the target, creating a cone of silence. For the final 30 seconds of the approach, the hunter was blind. The U-boat commander, listening to the swelling roar of the destroyer's propellers, knew this rhythm by heart. He knew that for half a minute, he was invisible. In that brief window, he could turn hard, dive deep, or stop his engines, slipping out of the lethal zone before the barrels of high explosives even hit the water. The result was a statistical catastrophe for the Allies. In the early war, a depth charge attack had a lethal probability of roughly 3%. It took an average of 60 attacks to sink a single U-boat. Meanwhile, the German wolfpacks were sinking Allied shipping faster than the industrialized world could replace it, sending millions of tons of food, fuel, and munitions to the seabed, and bringing Britain to the very brink of starvation by the spring of 1943. The situation had devolved into an existential crisis. Winston Churchill, a man rarely given to pessimism, confessed that the U-boat peril was the only thing that ever truly frightened him during the war. The supply lines connecting the factories of North America to the front lines of Europe were bleeding out. If the Atlantic lifeline was severed, there would be no invasion of Europe, no D-Day, and likely no victory. The Royal Navy needed a miracle, but the naval establishment was rigid, steeped in tradition, and slow to change. The miracle would not come from an admiral or a career tactician, but from the unlikely partnership between a Canadian chemist and a maverick British Army officer who believed that the accepted rules of naval warfare were fundamentally wrong. Charles Frederick Goodhue was a scientist from Manitoba, a man who viewed war as a series of engineering problems waiting to be solved. Working within the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development Department, dismissively nicknamed the Weezers and Dodgers, Goodhue looked at the depth charge statistics and realized the problem wasn't the explosive power. It was the delivery system. The blindness of the final approach was the fatal flaw. He hypothesized that a ship needed to attack while maintaining sonar contact, which meant throwing the weapon ahead of the ship, over the bow, rather than rolling it off the stern. To realize this vision, Goodhue required a launching mechanism that was both lightweight and powerful, a paradox in naval engineering. He found his answer in the work of Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker, a veteran of the Indian Army and a quintessential British eccentric who had developed the Blacker bombard, a spigot mortar originally designed for anti-tank warfare. Unlike a traditional cannon that fires a shell out of a barrel, a spigot mortar consists of a steel rod, the spigot that fits inside the tail of the projectile. When the charge ignites, the projectile is pushed off the rod. It was a crude but effective system that eliminated the need for heavy, rifled barrels. Goodhue and Blacker, an odd couple of science and soldiering, set about adapting this land-based weapon for the heaving decks of a destroyer in the North Atlantic. The engineering challenges were immense. They needed a projectile that would fly through the air, enter the water without shattering, and sink fast enough to catch a diving submarine. They built models, tested firing patterns, and calculated trajectories, eventually settling on a design that resembled nothing the nautical world had ever seen. They called it the Hedgehog. The weapon was a lattice of steel spines, a cradle mounting 24 spigots. When loaded, it looked bristly and strange, earning its animal moniker. But the genius of the Hedgehog lay not in its appearance, but in its ballistics and its fuse. The 24 projectiles were fired in a rippling salvo, launching in pairs to reduce the recoil stress on the ship's deck. They arched through the air and splashed into the water roughly 200 yards ahead of the ship, forming a large elliptical pattern about 140 feet across. This circular net of explosives was designed to entrap the submarine. Crucially, the projectiles were streamlined, while a depth charge drifted down like a leaf, sinking at a sluggish 10 feet per second. A Hedgehog projectile sliced through the water at over 22 feet per second. It could reach a deep-diving U-boat in a third of the time, drastically reducing the enemy's window for evasion. But the true stroke of brilliance, the innovation that would psychologically shatter the German submarine force, was the contact fuse. Depth charges relied on hydrostatic pressure. They exploded whether they hit anything or not. These explosions churned the water into a frothing, chaotic mess of bubbles that reflected sonar beams, rendering the ship's sensors useless for 15 minutes. If a captain missed with depth charges, he was deafened by his own attack, allowing the U-boat to slip away in the acoustic fog. The Hedgehog was different. Its projectiles were armed with contact fuses. If they missed the submarine, they simply sank to the bottom of the ocean, silent and deadly only to the seabed. There was no explosion, no wall of bubbles, no loss of sonar contact. The destroyer commander could watch the attack on his instruments, see that he had missed, and immediately adjust his course for a second strike. He could pound the contact relentlessly without ever blinding himself. However, if a projectile did strike, it meant it had physically collided with the hull of the U-boat. The resulting explosion of 35 pounds of torpex and explosives significantly more powerful than TNT against the pressure hull of a submerged submarine was catastrophic. A single hit was usually enough to crack the hull like an eggshell. The introduction of the Hedgehog was not met with immediate applause. The Royal Navy was an institution built on centuries of tradition, and many captains were deeply suspicious of this contraption that replaced their heavy guns. Early trials were plagued by failures, often due to inexperienced crews who had not been trained to interpret the new attack geometry. Success rates hovered at a dismal 5% initially, leading many to dismiss the weapon as a failure. It took the intervention of Winston Churchill himself, who witnessed a demonstration at Chequers and was captivated by the logic of the weapon, to force it into mass production. By 1943, as training improved and the tactics were refined at specialized schools like HMS Ferret in Northern Ireland, the lethality of the Hedgehog began to reveal itself. The mathematics of the war shifted violently. A well-trained crew using Hedgehog was not merely twice as effective as one using depth charges. Statistics from the end of the war would show they were over 10 times more effective. The ratio of attacks to kills dropped from 60-1 to roughly 6-1. For the German U-boat crews, the arrival of the Hedgehog marked the beginning of a nightmare from which there was no waking. In the early years, a submarine under attack experienced a terrifying but comprehensible ordeal: the ping of sonar, the revving of propellers, and then the waiting game for the depth charges. They could hear the clicks of the detonators, feel the concussions, and count the explosions. They knew when they were being hunted, and they knew when they had escaped. Hedgehog robbed them of this awareness. Because the projectiles only detonated on contact, a U-boat could be under attack without ever knowing it. The missiles would streak down silently on all sides. A near miss was indistinguishable from the ambient noise of the ocean. There was no warning, no buildup of tension, no explosion to signal that the enemy had missed. There was only silence, followed by instant obliteration. One moment, the boat was operating normally. The next, a contact fuse triggered a warhead against the hull, causing immediate, crushing implosion. Survivors from Hedgehog attacks were incredibly rare because the destruction was usually total and instantaneous. This psychological terror was compounded by the fact that German intelligence could not figure out what was happening. When a U-boat survived a depth charge attack, it returned to base and reported the tactics used by the British. But U-boats struck by Hedgehog rarely returned. They simply vanished. The German High Command, including Admiral Karl Dönitz, knew that their losses were spiking dramatically in the spring of 1943, the period known as Black May, but they attributed it to improved radar or air cover. They did not understand that the fundamental geometry of the underwater battle had changed. The hunters were no longer blind in the final seconds. They were watching, waiting, and striking with surgical precision. The silence of the Hedgehog was its greatest asset, masking its existence even as it decimated the U-boat fleet. The narrative of the Hedgehog is best understood not through statistics, but through the experiences of the men who wielded it. Commander Donald McIntyre, a legendary U-boat hunter of the Royal Navy, described the shift in confidence the weapon provided. With depth charges, an attack was a gambler, hope and prey maneuver. With Hedgehog, it was a calculated execution. He recalled the grim satisfaction of firing a salvo, waiting for the seconds to tick by, and hearing silence. That silence meant the target was still there, still being tracked, and ready for another volley. But when the sound came a dull, heavy thud, followed by the grinding noise of a hull breaking up, it was final. There was no need to circle back and check for oil. The physics of the explosion meant the target was destroyed. Perhaps the most harrowing demonstration of the weapon's efficiency occurred in the Pacific Theater. Aboard the USS England, a destroyer escort commanded by Lieutenant Commander Walton Pendleton but tactically led by his executive officer, Lieutenant John Williamson. In late May 1944, the England engaged in a 12-day patrol that stands as the single most devastating anti-submarine performance in naval history. Using the Hedgehog, the crew of the England hunted down and sank 6 Japanese submarines in less than 2 weeks. The encounters were brutal and efficient. On May 19th, they obliterated I-16. 3 days later, RO-106, the next day, RO-104. The crew worked in a state of exhausted, robotic precision, reloading the spigots, tracking the targets, and firing again. Lieutenant Williamson later spoke of the strange, detached morality of the operation. He was a young man from Alabama, leading a crew of equally young Americans, methodically extinguishing the lives of hundreds of Japanese sailors. When asked by a seaman how he felt about the killing, Williamson replied with the stark logic of total war: the more they sank, the sooner it would end. Yet, the memory of those 12 days, the oil slicks and the debris rising from the deep, haunted him for the rest of his life. The Hedgehog made the killing easier, but it did not make it cleaner. Yet, amidst the industrial slaughter, there were moments of profound humanity that illustrated the peculiar honor of the war at sea. In February 1944, the Canadian frigate HMCS Voskizu, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Fraser, engaged U-257 in the North Atlantic. After a series of Hedgehog attacks and depth charges that crippled the submarine, the German boat was forced to surface. The engagement that followed was short. The Canadian gunners raked the U-boat, leaving it a burning wreck. But as the submarine began to sink, the German captain Kapitan Hüttenheinz Rehi was seen on the conning tower, not firing back, but waving his arms and throwing life rafts to his crew in the freezing water. He ensured his men were clear before stepping back into his doomed vessel to ride it to the bottom. The crew of the Voskizu then began the arduous task of pulling the German survivors from the icy Atlantic. The Canadian sailors, who had been trying to kill these men minutes earlier, now shared their dry clothes, their cigarettes, and their rations. They discovered that the monsters of the deep were terrifyingly similar to themselves, young, frightened, and cold. This duality, the ruthless innovation of the Hedgehog designed to kill without mercy, and the enduring impulse of sailors to save one another from the sea define the Allied experience. The legacy of the Hedgehog extends far beyond the rusting hulls of U-boats on the ocean floor. It represented a paradigm shift in how wars were fought and won. It was a victory of civilian-military integration, proving that the eccentric ideas of a chemist like Gudiv could be more valuable than the traditional dogmas of the Admiralty. It paved the way for the modern anti-submarine weapons of the Cold War and beyond. The Soviet Union, recognizing the weapon's effectiveness, copied the design almost exactly for their own naval forces. And the principle of a head-throwing weapons remains a standard in naval warfare today. The Squid and Limbo systems that followed were direct descendants of Gudiv's lattice of steel spines. By the time Germany surrendered in May 19, the Battle of the Atlantic had been decisively won. The supply lines were secure, the armies of liberation had crossed the channel, and the U-boat arm had been shattered, suffering a casualty rate of 75%, the highest of any branch of service in the war. While radar, code-breaking, and long-range aircraft all played pivotal roles, the Hedgehog was the sharp end of the spear. It was the weapon that turned the hunter into the prey. The story of its creation is a testament to the desperation of 1940 and the ingenuity that arose to meet it. It is a reminder that in the face of annihilation, when the old tools fail and the enemy seems invincible, the path to victory often lies in the quiet, unheralded work of those who dare to reimagine the physics of the battlefield. The silence of the Hedgehog, sinking through the dark waters of the Atlantic, was the sound of the tide turning, a silent herald of the victory that would eventually liberate a continent.